Hi, in this episode I'm going to button up the coolant system and then do some wiring. There's a lot of wiring to do, so I'll keep it brief, but just give you the overview of what I've done. So first of all, we'll do the routing of the coolant hoses underneath the engine. So here we have the output of the water pump, and it goes through a 45 into a right angle bend. That then goes into a hard tube that goes underneath the oil filter up until the front of the car, and then we're going to get it down into the bottom radiator hose. So let's do that. With the bottom coolant hose running next to the engine, I wanted to get it up a little bit so that it was above the lower wishbone joint, but obviously below the steering column. So that gives you roughly a level. I'm a little bit worried about the oil filter, but I think there'll be enough flexibility in there that if it does interfere, that I can just push the pipe down a bit when I need to get the oil filter off. So now that it's roughly at the level, I can start creating the pieces to join from the end to the radiator and underneath the engine from the output of the water pump. So I have the hoses cut underneath the engine from the water pump going around to the pipe on the side. Now the front pipe. Okay, here is the lower coolant hose, all pre-assembled. As you can see, we've got all the clamps on it. Now we've got to install it into the car. I installed the lower radiator hose. What I did do is put a little bit of hose around the pipe here so that when I clamp it onto the chassis, it doesn't rub up against the pipe, so it won't wear through. So it's just a bit of protection there. And similarly here, I've got them zip tied up against the chassis just to hold them in place. So that looks good. Okay, we've got everything buttoned up now. From the thermostat to the radiator, this here is a little section where I can put in a temperature sensor to measure the coolant temperature. So that goes in there. And then from the hose down here, I've got that going to the bottom of the expansion tank. And from the top of the expansion tank, I've got that going to the top of the radiator. So any sort of air that's caught in here will bleed into the expansion tank. So essentially it's a self-bleeding system. The only thing I need to do is perhaps just put something there, either put it into a small catch can and mount that in the car somewhere. So that finishes the coolant system. So we're about to start the electrics in earnest. I've done some test fitting of the wiring harness just to see where things go, but the first thing to do is to do the dash. So what I've got here, I've got all the switches in place. I had to add some extra switches specifically for the washer wiper because the car didn't have that before. We've got the three instruments here for oil pressure, water temperature and fuel. And on the left-hand side, we've got the speedometer and tachometer. So this is what it looks like on the front. Now this will mount to the chassis and then onto the scuttle through these bolts here. Going around, we can see the ECU panel. Now I've just got it laying in here and there's nothing connected. But what you can see that there is a mess of connections on the back of the switches already. So I've already started doing that. So what I plan to do is to have the dash panel completely removable. So I'm going to have Deutsch connectors between the dash panel and the wiring that we'll find on the ECU panel. That way I can remove the dash independently of the ECU panel and with just a few connectors. So that's my plan of action. The first thing I did was to draw myself a wiring diagram. This is a wiring diagram predominantly for the dash panel. So we've got the individual switches, we've got the gauges up here and down here. And the idea being is that I'd like to understand where all the wires go, the color coding. And you can see these three bus lines here and the ground line. So what we've got the illumination signal up the top, we've got the constant 12 volt, and we've got the switch 12 volt underneath it. Various instruments need to be either on permanent or on switched 12 volts, and the illumination goes to most gauges and switches. So that's the plan, and this has been through a number of refinements, and I'm changing it as I go along. But what I am doing is keeping note of all the connections here. So you can, if you look carefully, you can see that here this is J, and I've got a spreadsheet that identifies what connection goes onto what pin of a Deutsch connector, so that I know how to wire them together. Now, if we have a look at the rat's nest underneath here, you can see, okay, the wiring diagram looks quite neat, but here we have sockets for each switch. We've got wires coming out. I've hooked together all the grounds, and I've hooked together all the illumination signals, and they all go together. I'm also about to start the gauges over here. One of the things I'm doing, which is a little bit different, I've got a water temperature gauge here. And I also want, because I've put in the oil thermostat, I want to make sure that the oil thermostat is working correctly and that the thermostat is opening up at the right temperature. So I'm putting in a second temperature sensor into the oil pan of the engine, and I'm running the sensor wire up, and I'm going to use this switch here to actually switch between water temperature and oil temperature. It's easy to do just via this switch, and it allows me to switch over between one, and it means I don't have to add another gauge there that ideally I'd only really need in the beginning to just confirm that things are working correctly. Okay, here everything is wired up in preparation for adding in the Deutsch connectors. We have the connectors going to the instruments, the small instruments, the speedo and tacho over here, and then all the switching, the power, and the switching wires here. So this is the next task. I've now wired everything together, and I've sorted them into connectors. So this is connector A, connector B, connector C is here, and this is the power connector over here. So now it's time to put the Deutsch connectors on. So here I have the receptacle, and I'm going to put male connectors on this side because the dash is unpowered, and I want to have female protectors on the live side just to be safe. So I need to use the crimp on each wire, and then insert them in the right place in the receptacle. So I'll do that for the power connector first, and we'll go from there. So here I have the power connector all wired up and inserted into the connector. So what we have here is the Deutsch connector, an 8-pin Deutsch connector, and I've doubled up on the 12 volt, the switch 12 volt, the ground, and the illumination power lines. This connector, as you can see, it's still a mess. That will all be loomed up properly. But the first thing is to get all the connectors in, and then I'll have time to wire it all, make it all pretty, to loom it all together and to make it all intelligible. But it doesn't make sense to do that until everything has been tested. So put the connectors on, tidy it up a little bit, perhaps some zip ties, and then put it in the car and test it with the car. And once it's all done, then tape it all up so that it is beautiful.